the ineffable one of the Iamblichus, is transcendent in that it is not simply something we talk about as being not this, but is in fact not a part of reality in any way, shape, or form. It is simply disconnected. We cannot think of God not because of our limitation. We simply cannot think about God because there is no God to think of. It is beyond being. Because of this, Dionysius' apophatic theology is not merely negative. To make a negating statement about something is to assume there is a positive thing to negate. God is all good. God is not all good. So in this, Dionysius will contradict Aristotle, and he says, we should not consider the negations to be in opposition to the affirmations, but far rather than it, capital I, which is above every abstraction and definition, is above the privations. So it is not that, it's also not that, and realistically it's also not that, ad infinitum. And then we stop, or drink, either way. When Dionysius says we cannot say anything about God, it's not because we have nothing to say, because if you've been here all week, we've clearly had things to say about God. But for Dionysius and for the apophatic theology, there is simply nothing to talk about. Which is why a lot of Orthodox Christians, Orthodox lowercase, don't like Dionysius. If you read Pope Benedict's edict about, you should all read Dionysius, but ignore the fact that he's a cold, lifeless, Neoplatonic God. Yeah, he basically says you should read Dionysius in spite of his Neoplatonism, which to me is pretty much all there is. And the best reason to read Dionysius, and you should get all the other stuff from it. And if the idea that Dionysius was not a Christian is true, then there is nothing but Platonism in it at all. And then you should definitely read Dionysius. So this unspeakable, unthinkable, super essential God is the source of being, capital B. And this again is part of Dionysian Neoplatonism and part of Neoplatonism in general. In this way of thinking, and I've talked about this a little bit, the ontological source of something or some quality, such as being, life, or wisdom, which is a triad of qualities that Dionysius talks about, and it is a version of what is called the noetic triad of life, being, and intellect that comes out of Plotinus but is developed by Porphyry, and you'll actually see it in Sethian texts coming from Porphyry into the Sethians because of their dialogue. So this quality, such as being, life, or wisdom, doesn't possess that thing, which is hard to grasp, because usually when we think about like normal stuff, we're really thinking about creation rather than emanation. So I have children, they have part of me in them, whereas God emanates, and the stuff that's in those things that God emanates, none of that's in God. At the same time, if there was no God, there could be no emanation, there could be no being.
I wonder if this gets taken up in later thinking, especially in Böhme, and then the appropriation of Böhme by Schelling, who talks about, especially in the life of God, that God has to be the negation of his basis, of his origin. And the analogy that he uses, which I think is quite good, is that if we think of a line, the origin of the line is the point, but the line is specifically the negation of the point. It's not just a succession of points. It's something that the point very much is not. I wonder if there's a similarity there.
It does sound like it. Not entirely, because from that analogy it seems that the line is connected to the point in some way.
Yes.
Whereas here, there is no connection between God and that which comes after God.
Thank you. That's helpful.
You're very welcome. Okay. So this idea of being, life, and wisdom, and the idea of the source not having that which it produces within it. Some of this comes out of later Neoplatonism, out of Iamblichus. I guess I did that to confuse you, I guess. Sorry. Dionysius does not use Iamblichus's language. Most of the later Neoplatonists use this idea of what I call the noetic moments. We were talking about this yesterday, Bishop Tim and I. But they all use the idea. Iamblichus talks about the noetic realm, which is kind of the equivalent of the pleroma in Gnosticism, this is the intellect, sort of. In trying to understand how everything is sort of related to each other, and to try to talk about what comes first, second, and third in a place where it doesn't make sense to have a notion of time, time to physical things. Iamblichus comes up with this idea of noetic moments. There's the unparticipated moment, the participated moment, and then that which is in participation. And these represent, you can reflect these upwards into God, where you'll have three different kinds of one, depending on how we view it, and then you can reflect it downwards into the psychic realm, and then you get regular time. Here, the first moment, this unparticipated moment, is the being, or the hypostasis as it is in and of itself, which is hard to understand because we cannot experience it in that first moment, because as soon as you're looking at it, you're not looking at it in and of itself. That's the second moment, that's the participated moment, or how we see that hypostasis. It's sort of like you all see me, and there's a version of me running around your heads, and I apologize for that. But that isn't me. That's your version of me. That's me, that's your participated moment of me. And then the me that's in your head, it influences you in some way. Again, I apologize. And how that has changed you, how the me that is me comes through you, that is the third moment in participation. So there's me as me as you see me as I manifest through you. I know it's scary when I put it that way, isn't it? So these are the three moments. Iamblichus reflects this upwards, though he doesn't say he is, to God. He'll talk about the one in its unparticipated mode, the ineffable one. Just a big, I don't know. And then we'll have the simply one, which is the participated one. It's still a big I don't know, but it's the thing that we're talking about when we talk about God. And then there is the one being, or the one existent, which is that third moment where everything sort of starts coming through. In Iamblichus, this gets reflected then directly into the noetic realm. God is above that, or beyond that. And then that becomes the top level of the noetic realm. It's one of these funky things in Neoplatonism where the lowest ontological level of one realm is the highest level of the realm below. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, just quickly again, what was the name for the third?
In participation.
In participation, thank you.
And I like using, even though I don't like E.R. Dodds, because he's mainly the reason why nobody studies Iamblichus, I like his phraseology where he will talk about you participate this thing, it's not you are participating. He uses a very, very peculiar way of talking about something, which I cannot recreate for you on the fly, unfortunately. But I will invariably find it somewhere in here, and it'll sound really weird to you because it's not grammatically correct, and that's kind of the point. Because it's not participation in the way we normally think of, well, I'm hanging out, I'm talking with you, and we're talking together, and we're participating in the conversation, and it isn't like that, because we're ontologically equal. I cannot participate you. And that's the language. I would participate you. I would not be participating you. So you say, I participate you. And I cannot do that, because we are at the same level. You only participate in that which is above you. And while there are things below us, they're not capable of participating because of their low ontological state. They simply are what they are, whereas we are what we are, but we've forgotten a lot of it, and so we must participate that which is above us to remember what we are and sort of find our proper space in the cosmos. Other questions so far? Okay. Now, even though the Analyst talks about the ineffable one and the simply one and the one being, there aren't actually three ones, because that would make no sense. That would make even less sense than what we've been talking about so far. Right, so these moments do not reflect three different things. They are the same thing expressed in three different ways. The unparticipated entity does not cease to be itself while protecting a quality, the logi, for instance, to be participated, nor while being participated. God is always God, even if I'm looking at some godlike thing, even if God is being expressed through me, God is still what God is, regardless of those things. God doesn't change. That's the cool thing about being God, actually. One of them. So, all of this is really a matter of how the same being appears to different modes of cognition. And the result is different modes of the same being, from its single unparticipated form to the qualities projected for participation to the beings that participate those qualities. Each level is a different appearance of the same cause. But, and this is the part that will mess with you more, in Platonic ontology, appearances, icons, have being. So each of those three modes, while they are still God is still God, all of those reflected realities are also real. So every level is real in its own particular way, but is not as real as that which it came from. So if we were going to talk about us, for instance, we would talk about there's the whole soul, which is the top of the psychic realm, which is itself merely nous, the divine mind, reflected into the psychic realm. And then the whole soul emanates, as it were, the world soul, which then produces us. We could say there's really just the whole soul. That is the soul itself in its first undifferentiated moment, soul as soul. And then there's when we look at soul, we see the world soul. And then when it gets to individual souls, it's us. And we're all real. Descartes notwithstanding. But we're real in a very different way from the world soul that's above us, which is different from the whole soul that is above it. So it's bizarre. It's not how we're used to thinking of things as being real. Well, either it's real, either in itself, or it's not itself. In Platonism, it's both. Questions? Too many for words. So the one, in its third moment, is the source of being beyond being. The one itself does not produce other things. Production is, platonically speaking, a type of movement, and movement must be based on that which is motionless. The whole unmoved mover thing that we've talked about, if you've read Aristotle, you've probably, or Aquinas, right? Yeah, which totally ripping off the Platonists. Actually, almost all of Aquinas' arguments are in Proclus. So, for something to exist in the first place, it has to stand on something. Right? It's sort of like when you're taking physics class in high school and you do things with friction and stuff, and when you're doing your math, it's always based on this perfect frictionless world. Well, that's awesome, but nothing can actually move in a frictionless world because you can't push yourself against something that has no friction. How would you walk if there's no friction between your feet and the floor, right? So God is the friction, as it were. Late Platonic ontology depends on the idea of that unmoved mover, the stable ground upon which everything else moves. If the one itself produced, it would therefore move, and there would have to be something beyond the one to allow it to do that. And then we'd say, well, that's the one. Which is the argument, I think, in the Republic about the good. And it's certainly the argument that's in Proclus's Elements of Theology about, well, if there's this thing that we call the good, but we desire something beyond that, well, then that's actually the good, not this other thing.
Augustine makes the same argument as well.
Yeah. It's very popular.
Yeah.
And so this is how we get to God being the source of being with having no being itself. But by God's, and because the English language is horrible, existence, because there's nothing else I can use for that, because there is God in some theoretical manner, everything else can exist. It's a God, it's like the Higgs boson, I guess. That's why it's called the God particle. Don't even know. Sorry. Yes, Ben?
Why the hell is this not a materialist theory with material being infinitely rarefied at the very end of it?
You would have, Proclus talks about infinity,
Right.
and why you can't have something be infinite. And I don't remember the argument very well because I'm not a Proclean scholar.
Right. I guess what I mean though is this strikes me that this doesn't necessarily have to be a spiritual system at the end. It strikes me as a system with some spirits in it. But you get far enough and anything you'd attribute to being spiritual or anything like that is among the things removed.
Yes.
Yes.
In Platonism, the only thing that is unmoved is God.
Right.
There are, and I don't remember all the language because again it's Proclus, and I'm not a Proclus guy. But he'll talk about things that are self-moved then, and things that are moved by other things. So we get the unmoved thing, the self-moved thing, and that which is moved. And then there are different ways that something can be moved. It can be moved from within or without. And those are also ontologically different things. So that which moves by itself, like the soul, is superior to things that are moved. Things that are moved from within are superior to things that are moved from without. But it's a little tricky, at least in the Iamblichean material. Because
It's a little tricky.
Yes, only a little. To me, I've been doing this for a little bit. Because in Dionysius, though not in Proclus, who explains everything far more than you really want him to, but that they're very loose on what levels of reality they're often talking about, these beings being on. And there's a distinction between essence, power, and activity. And for instance, in Iamblichus, the gods have essence, and their essence is way up here, but you have sublunar gods. But we're not talking about sublunar gods who have their essence down here in the sublunar realm. That's where their activity occurs. And so it gets a little bit confusing when we start talking about like the angels. Well, we'll talk about what they do, but that has nothing necessarily to do with what they are in some ways. So that's about as best as I can not answer your question.
Very satisfactory.
Thank you. Okay. So try to explain some of this stuff, especially this idea of God producing being, but having no being itself. God uses, or Dionysius uses, or God, whatever, uses the allegory. I don't know. God, again, apparently I'm now done speaking.
You've expended your life.
It's done. So Dionysius will use an allegory of light similar to the allegory of the sun in the Republic. The light is not that which is illuminated. Right? We don't necessarily see the light itself, but is beyond what is illuminated. And without light, there is no illumination. So if you've read the Republic, this is like right after the allegory of the cave, I believe. It should be somewhat familiar, to at least to you.
Yeah.
So God here is the source of the light. In the Republic, the good, I believe, is the source of the light. Which in Neoplatonic terms represents God's logi, these things that sort of come out from God that represent God's power, God's activity, as it were. Within God, there's no distinction between the logi. But exterior, because that's God in the first moment, so it's just God is God. But exterior to God, they are the distinguishing principles that make beings be. They are what help differentiate us from other types of things. And will eventually, once we get down into incarnation, help us differentiate me from you, and what kind of person am I versus what kind of person are you. In neo-platonism, there's this idea of leader gods, that we come from the series of a leader god. So you might be from the series of Hermes, or from the series of Zeus, or from the series of Ares or Aphrodite. And that means you have a very particular essence that is unique to yourself. And it gets much more complicated than that, so I won't go into it much farther. Read my book. That's the one plug I will do for that. But these help, in order for us to figure out who we are, we depend on these logi and the forms to sort of, get to remember. This idea of remembering is fairly important as part of our reversion to our source. Remember that abiding, proceeding reversion that I talked about, that I mentioned at the beginning. As God's light not only illuminates things, but makes them what they are, by being within them, God's light interpenetrates everything. Remember, God is in everything, but not any of those things. God is simultaneously transcendent and immanent, not in the way that we might think that God walks around on earth in some sort of physical form, though we'll get to that, of course, because we are writing as a Christian, right? So we'll have the incarnation. But by this sort of, the Amicus, I think, writes that the gods are present immaterially to the material. If that makes any sense to you, awesome. So that God is there, but not in any way that we can just sort of point to and go, well, there's God. Which is important because Dionysus is not a pantheist. God is in everything, but if you took everything, you still don't have God. And he's not really a monist either, because God isn't just the one and everything's the one, because Platonic ontology says anything that exists. So the multiplicity is real. So is the unity. And our work, theurgically and liturgically from Dionysus' perspective, is to move from the particular to the universal. That's what his liturgy is pretty much about. Questions?
You could almost parallel it with energy, right?
In what way?
Well, energy is in everything. It even makes up the particles that, speaking of Higgs boson, but it can't really be defined. I mean, well, other than we say it's energy, right? It's in everything, but it is not anything. It becomes matter, but it is not matter.
Yeah, it's that weird overlay between Newtonian and quantum physics, where we kind of go, well, somewhere this seems to be real, and somewhere this seems to be real. I can't quite tell you where. And it is kind of like that. I always get a little.
That's a really crappy analogy, but
yeah, well, it's mine.
They kind of all are.
Yeah, and that's the point. I mean, no analogy when we're talking about God works. And that's Dionysus' entire point. And I always get a little mixed up when we start talking about energy, because I think of energia in Platonic terms, it is an activity. And that means something completely different than what we mean by energy now. Okay. So this is our apophatic God, if we can call it, if we can actually say this is, which strictly speaking we cannot. And so let's be done with that before brains start leaking. And we're talking about a cataphatic God. It is assumed, I have yet to read a paper on the subject that does not assume that the divine names talks about God as though God exists. Which which I highly disagree with now, but we'll get to that. So, cataphatic, the opposite of apophatic, that which is in existence, sort of thing. So, although God as nothing is the ultimate point of Dionysius' theology, which is kind of funky because if you look at the divine names versus the, totally blanking on it, mystical theology. The divine, it is kind of like looking between the Old Testament and the New Testament in size. The divine names is huge, and the mystical theology is tiny, but the point is the mystical theology. And so if you're Christian, that's a really good analogy. Because then the point is the New Testament. If you're Jewish, not so much. So, Dionysius spends a lot of time talking about as though it were something. Dionysius says God's essential nature lies in goodness, and as the source of being, the former of which, like the latter, is derived from Platonic terminology. Right? We talk about the good, which Mar Thomas has already brought up. Dionysius first writes of God as something, because God as nothing is very theoretical, though I would argue theoretical in the Platonic use of the term theoria. It is a contemplation, which puts it on a much higher level. It's not just theoretical in the English sense, where it's just something we talk about, and it doesn't really mean anything. Here, your theoria as contemplation is something that you engage in some way. And so we could call the divine names practical theology. And Dionysius will cite Matthew, Nehemiah, Exodus, Revelation, Hebrews, John's, a whole slew of biblical texts to describe God. God is life, God is wisdom, God is beauty, God is the Father, the Word, the Spirit. Terms that are probably familiar to all of you in this room. At least I would hope so, especially if you're wearing a collar today. Otherwise, Mar Thomas will have some words with you later today.
What if Mar Thomas is the problem?
I guess it becomes your problem, doesn't it?
And the buck stops there.
Yeah, it's good to be an outsider. Dionysius employs the divine epitaphs in two ways: as unified names and as distinct names. And he makes a very big point of this. Names such as super good, super God, super living, and yes, and good, life, wisdom, being, beauty, and so forth. These are the unified names that are common to all of God. The super terminology refers to God as abstraction beyond all such normal goods. Also, super God is God beyond God. Super good is good beyond good, and so on. The normative language, good, life, being, wisdom, etc., refers to God as the cause of all things. And the names, contrary to how they're often understood, actually refer to God's gifts, not to God itself. God is apophatic.
And this sounds more like the Orthodox idea of the difference between God's essence and his energeia.
Yeah, and a lot of Orthodox stuff is Platonic and Neo-Platonic. I mean, yeah, it's right on with that. So these names, the super names, I know the Man of Steel is coming out soon. We'll have that in our head, I know. And the ordinary language, these are what Dionysius calls divine unions. They do not refer to distinct divine elements, but to God as a whole because of God's, quote, super unified unity, unquote. Yes. I'm not going to even try to explain that. Because God is why I am. Sorry. Because God is one. I am. Because God is one and the one. Any title applied to God must apply to all of God, because God, especially in the first moment, there's no differentiation. So anything that you say is God, that's all of God. And according to Dionysius, To think anything less of these divine names is blasphemy because it denies God's